From flying million-dollar private jets, to dying broke in Monticello, to losing your entire life savings in a Ponzi scheme, and then making it all back. This is every U.S. president's wealth explained. But first, this is the Broke Boy Club. Presidents with a net worth under $1 million in today's money. And when I say today's money, I'm referring to the year 2020. Because if I adjusted for 2025 inflation, everyone would be a trillionaire. Except James Buchanan, one of the poorest presidents in American history. Born into a log cabin with a big family, he never had much more than the basics. And as congressman, senator, and secretary of state, Buchanan received government paychecks, which stunk. And back then, he couldn't insider trade his way into millions. I'm looking at you, Pelosi. Kinda like Abe Lincoln, another log cabin kid who clawed his way up to success. And although he made a name for himself as a lawyer, it didn't exactly rain dollar bills. Until he became president and earned a $25,000 salary, which is like $750,000 in today's dollars. We're rich! The only problem, his term was cut short by John Wilkes Booth, leaving Mary Todd Lincoln to struggle financially after his death. But if you couldn't tell, America was pretty broke back then, because Lincoln's successor, also poor. Andrew Johnson started at rock bottom and apprenticed as a tailor just to get by. Then climbed the political ladder as mayor, governor, U.S. senator, vice president, and eventually, president. But here's the kicker. Decades of public service didn't exactly make him rich. In fact, he left the White House with little more than he came in with, including a whole lot of enemies in Congress. But at least Johnson didn't lose his entire life savings to a scam, like Ulysses S. Grant, a military genius and war hero who grew up pretty poor. But after the Civil War, the public adored him, showering him with gifts and money. And by the time he marched into the White House, Grant had a solid chunk of change. Until he fell victim to a Ponzi scheme. Cause Grant entrusted his money to a Wall Street firm ran by his son and Ferdinand Ward, a swindler so slimy he earned the nickname the best hated man in the United States. How charming. And overnight, Grant went from wealthy war hero to having $80 in his pocket. $80. But he didn't quit. With throat cancer closing in and his family's future on the line, Grant reached for the only weapon he had left, his pen, and feverishly poured his final months into writing his memoirs. And against all odds, it paid off. Because after his death, they became a bestseller, generating $450,000 for his wife and children. Good job, big guy. You made up for it. But while some presidents rode the roller coaster of riches, others never got rich at all, like Woodrow Wilson, who spent most of his career in academia as president of Princeton University, then governor of New Jersey. Respectable jobs, important jobs. But financially, those roles came with pretty modest paychecks. And hey, at least he saved his pennies, unlike this next president who couldn't stop flexing. Because Chester A. Arthur went full Gilded Age baller, buying a palatial New York City townhouse, filling it with extravagant decor, and strutting around in the latest high fashion. But here's the twist. He wasn't born into money. Arthur was just a lawyer and the son of a preacher, which meant every dollar that hit his account usually walked right back out the door. Because Arthur lived by a simple philosophy. You can't take it with you. So why not spend it in style? And somebody should have mentioned that to James Garfield, whose life was tragically cut short. Because Garfield was a boy genius. Born into poverty and driven by education, he ascended into politics and served nearly 20 years in Congress before becoming president. And then suddenly, bang! Just months into his term, he was assassinated at 49 years old, never having time to build wealth. But what he did leave behind was something bigger, a legacy of putting education and public service above money. Come on, you gotta respect that. Kind of like Calvin Coolidge, who came from a frugal New England background and carried thriftiness everywhere he went. He practiced law, climbed the political ladder, eventually made it to the White House. But here's the thing. Silent Cal never dabbled in business deals or real estate. So his net worth stayed, well, modest, just like the man himself. All right, enough with the brokies. Let's raise the stakes. Because these presidents weren't just living on salaries. They stacked assets, built estates, and left behind fortunes worth an estimated $1 to $10 million in today's dollars. Like William McKinley, who didn't inherit a dime. In fact, during the Panic of 1893, he went completely bankrupt after co-signing a couple of bad loans while governor of Ohio. Rookie mistake. But luckily, his supporters rallied and helped him repay his debts. And with his Canton, Ohio home adding some value, McKinley ended up doing all right in the end. But hey, if you can't make money, might as well marry into it, right? Because that's exactly what Warren G. Harding did. His wife Florence was the daughter of a wealthy businessman, and she was sharp. Because she rolled up her sleeves and turned Harding's newspaper, the Marion Star, into a real moneymaker. And that paper ended up being Harding's biggest source of wealth. Go give your wife a kiss and tell her you love her. And you know that saying, your network is your net worth? Well, Franklin Pierce lived it, because he built a successful law practice, was the son of the governor of New Hampshire, and married Jane Appleton, whose father just happened to be the president of Bowdoin College. With that kind of circle, Pierce stayed modestly wealthy most of his life. Same deal with Rutherford B. Hayes, a successful lawyer in Ohio, who married into a well-to-do family. And after his presidency, Hayes retired to Spiegel Grove, a 25-acre estate with a 10,000-square-foot mansion. Honestly, I could get used to this. Meanwhile, William Howard Taft stacked his wealth the old-fashioned way, through a lifetime of legal and public service. The guy was a lawyer, judge, Secretary of War, president, Yale professor, and Chief Justice of the United States. Talk about a resume! But even with all those prestigious titles, Taft never really built a massive fortune. He lived comfortably, sure, but mostly off a steady career in a solid home base in Cincinnati. Kinda like Millard Fillmore, who worked as a lawyer and even helped found the school that became SUNY Buffalo. But here's the catch. None of that made him rich. After leaving the White House, Fillmore mostly lived off his investments and the fortune of his second wife. Smart man, smarter marriage. But let's take things up a notch with William Henry Harrison, who came from a prominent family and married into even more wealth. Because his father-in-law was one of the largest landowners in the Northwest and sold Harrison 160 acres in Ohio. Yeah. On top of that, Harrison expanded his holdings with land bounty grants, public land the government handed out to veterans as a thank you for their service. So yeah, Harrison was land rich, but cash poor. Cause when he died just 1 month into office, he left his family with nothing. Congress had to step in and grant his widow a special pension just so she could get by. So much for all this land. But at least his grandson, Benjamin Harrison, held onto a slice of the family land. But Benjamin didn't just coast on inheritance. He built his own fortune as a top-tier lawyer. How good was he? He once represented Venezuela in an international case against Britain, standing up for the little guy on a global stage. And when he wasn't busy winning court cases, Harrison was kicking it at his Victorian mansion in Indianapolis. Not bad, Benny boy. Not bad at all. On the other hand, Harry Truman was a little sketchy when it came to money. He grew up a farmer, stumbled through business, and nearly went bankrupt in the 1920s. So when he got into politics, Truman leaned hard into the image of the struggling everyman. And after his presidency, he even claimed to be strapped for cash, turning down lucrative corporate gigs just to look humble. Congress felt so bad, they created the presidential pension and doubled his salary while he was still in office. But here's the twist. Truman was a lot comfier than he let on, cause a 2021 investigation revealed that he left office with a modern equivalent of around $6 million, including a secret $2 million account he quietly pocketed. Hey, give me that! But this next guy didn't have to hide his way to wealth, because Zachary Taylor, our 12th president, was born into a prominent plantation family. And throughout his long military career, added to it by acquiring plantations in Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where over 100 slaves were forced to work. So Taylor's $7 million net worth came from the Old South, and certainly not a presidential paycheck. 'cause he barely had time to collect one, dying just 16 months into office. But speaking of short-term presidents, Gerald Ford had a pretty basic career. A longtime congressman who basically stumbled into the Oval Office after Watergate. However, Ford's real payday came after leaving the White House. 'Cause in just his first year out, Ford banked over $1 million in speaking fees and cushy board gigs. And he didn't stop there. He kept stacking checks on the boards of companies like American Express. Hey, is that even legal? At least Jimmy Carter made his post-presidency riches in a more respectable manner. Because after being a peanut farmer turned congressman turned president, Carter wasn't dead after he left office. So he reinvented himself, writing dozens of books, giving speeches, and in 2002 even won the Nobel Peace Prize, which came with a cool $1 million cash prize. So yeah, it's safe to say Carter enjoyed his retirement years. Kinda like Dwight D. Eisenhower, who spent the bulk of his career in the Army. But even as a 5-star general, the paychecks weren't exactly life-changing. 'Cause Ike's real wealth came from purchasing a 250-acre farm in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which skyrocketed in value over time. Add in some careful saving, a few best-selling books, and suddenly Eisenhower had himself a pretty comfy nest egg. A $10 million nest egg. Not bad for a farm boy turned supreme commander. But Joe Biden's road to 10 million might have been the most parabolic of them all. Because after spending 36 years as a senator, Biden consistently ranked among the poorest members of the Senate. And by 2009, his net worth was so low, he was juggling debt. But everything changed after he became vice president. In 2017 alone, Joe and Jill pulled in $11 million from book deals and speeches. And fast forward to 2023, and Forbes pegged his net worth at around $10 million. Talk about rags to riches, or maybe rags to book tour. But millionaire status? That was just the warm-up. Because this next tier of presidents weren't just comfortable, they were loaded. We're talking $10 to $50 million of net worth. Like James Polk, who came from a well-off family and married into a richer one. And sure, he served as Speaker of the House and Governor of Tennessee, but his real fortune didn't come from politics alone. It came from land. Nearly 900 acres of prime Mississippi cotton country, worked by dozens of slaves. A dark truth behind his spot in the Mega Million Club. On the other hand, Ronald Reagan didn't start out rich. He was the son of a shoe salesman turned Hollywood actor turned governor of California. And while governor, purchased a 688-acre ranch near Santa Barbara. Woohoo! But his big boy payday came after the White House, when Reagan cashed in on a blockbuster $2 million speaking tour in Japan, and scored a hefty advance for his autobiography, Perks of Being a Former President, and a former movie star. Meanwhile, Richard Nixon had a rockier transition after resigning from the Oval Office in disgrace. But little did he know, that might have been the best financial move he ever made, because Nixon found a way to monetize his notoriety, striking a lucrative TV deal with British journalist David Frost, agreeing to a series of televised interviews. And oh boy, did Nixon rake it in, 'cause he pulled in $600 grand from that deal. About $2.5 million in today's money. Stack that on top of book royalties, and Nixon went from disgrace to sitting on tens of millions of dollars by the time he died. But you know who actually had Nixon beat? Our second president, John Adams. And he had some help from his wife Abigail, who came from the wealthy Quincy family, one of the most prominent clans in early America. And together, they lived at their big ol' estate, Peacefield. This place is friggin' huge. And through his thriving law practice and presidential salary, Adams maintained his wealth over time. Enough to pass it on to his son, John Quincy Adams, who inherited Peacefield and married Louisa, the daughter of a wealthy American merchant. So even though John Quincy Adams spent most of his life in politics, money was never really a problem. Must be nice, born into power and a trust fund. But speaking of being born into American dynasties, some would say George H.W. Bush had a financial head start. His father was both a U.S. Senator and investment banker, and after World War II, George made his own fortune in the Texas oil industry, co-founding an offshore drilling company that turned him into a multi-millionaire. So yeah, by the time Bush reached the Oval Office, his presidential salary was basically pocket change. But while some presidents inherit their riches, others need to bring home the bacon themselves, like Grover Cleveland, who was born poor to the son of a minister, but worked his way up as a lawyer and invested his way to the big leagues. Because after his second presidency, Cleveland invested heavily in the stock market and watched his net worth balloon, which allowed him to retire at his beautiful Westland mansion in Princeton, New Jersey. Smart man, smart money. Kinda like Martin Van Buren, who built up a solid fortune the old-fashioned way, by pulling in steady income as a lawyer, then climbing the ranks as Secretary of State, Vice President, and finally President. But he didn't just save his money, he invested wisely. 'Cause his biggest asset was Lindenwold, a 225-acre estate in New York, where he comfortably retired. But not every president gets a comfy retirement. Like James Monroe, who married into a wealthy family, ran a sprawling Virginia plantation, and built a solid career as a lawyer. For a time, it looked like he was set for life, until it all came crashing down. 'Cause Monroe neglected his finances during his decades in politics, and by the time he left the White House, he was drowning in debt, forced to sell off his plantation just to stay afloat. So, despite having a $30 million net worth, Monroe retired nearly broke. Here's a coin with your face on it, sir. On the contrary, George W. Bush benefited from the Bush family name and Daddy's oil money. But even with that head start, he struggled to succeed in business until 1989 when he struck gold by investing in the Texas Rangers baseball team, turning his $600,000 investment into a $15 million payday. And the wins didn't stop there, because Bush earned post-presidential book deals and speaking fees that put his net worth around the $40 million mark. But enough of these lightweights. It's time to level up to the $50 to $100 million club with John Tyler, another president who hit the jackpot through inheritance and marriage, cause he inherited a Virginia tobacco plantation with enslaved workers, and while in office, married his second wife, an heiress with sprawling Long Island properties. Together, that wealth allowed Tyler to relax and retire at his Giga Mansion, Sherwood Forest Plantation. This is nice. And if you couldn't tell, marrying into money was the ultimate status symbol back then. But me? I married Miss Flappy for love, which is why I've got a badge and sunglasses instead of my face on the dollar bill. Unlike Franklin Roosevelt, whose face actually made it on the dime. Because the Roosevelt clan knew how to play the long game. For generations, they strategically intermarried with other powerful New York dynasties, like the Delanos. So by the time Franklin came along, he wasn't just born into privilege. He inherited a double fortune from both sides of the family, with his crown jewel being the Springwood Estate in Hyde Park, where FDR was born, lived most of his life, and was eventually buried. But if there's one thing that can beat a double dynasty, it's Netflix. Because Barack Obama's net worth shot into the $70 to $100 million range after his presidency, through book deals, speaking fees, and, oh yeah, a $50 million Netflix production deal. Turns out being popular pays well. But it wasn't just Barack cashing it, because his wife Michelle scored a $65 million cash advance for her best-selling memoir. If we're grabbing dinner, you two are picking up the bill. But another president who struck gold after leaving office was Bill Clinton, because Clinton had no family fortune and drew a modest salary as governor of Arkansas. In fact, after leaving the White House in 2001, the Clintons were buried in legal debt from the Whitewater investigation. Dude was this close to going broke. Until Bill and Hillary teamed up and got serious about their moolah, landing 2 book deals worth $15 million and $14 million respectively, and turning the speaking circuit into an ATM, raking in over $100 million in fees. But unlike most presidents in U.S. history, Herbert Hoover was a self-made millionaire before he stepped foot in the Oval Office. Orphaned at a young age, he clawed his way up by studying engineering at Stanford, and in his 20s and 30s was running mining operations around the globe, even owning silver mines in places like Burma. Sir, this one's a beauty. So, by the time he became president, Hoover had a $100 million net worth in today's dollars, making him one of the richest men in America at the time. But if you think $100 million is crazy, we're moving up to the $100 million plus tier. With presidents so rich, it kind of makes you wonder where it all came from. Like Lyndon B. Johnson, who grew up dirt poor in rural Texas and ended up filthy rich through some, let's just say, questionable business moves. Because in 1943, Lady Bird Johnson bought a failing Austin radio station, and soon after secured lucrative licenses from the FCC, the agency her husband conveniently oversaw as congressman. Coincidence? I think not. Cause those licenses turned KTBC into a Texas powerhouse that raked in millions. And from there, the Johnsons built a full-blown media empire, along with a 1,500-acre cattle ranch. But speaking of acres as far as the eye can see, James Madison was loaded. Born into a plantation family, he inherited part of the massive Montpelier estate, thousands of acres, dozens of slaves, and enough status to feel like a king. At its peak, Madison's fortune was the modern equivalent of $140 million. But it didn't last forever, because plantation profits started shrinking, and Madison's stepson, John Payne Todd, turned out to be an alcoholic gambling addict who buried himself in debt. It got so bad, Madison shelled out the modern equivalent of $1 million just to bail him out of trouble. So, by the time James Madison died, he was land rich, but cash poor. Until things got even worse. Cause Todd couldn't quit his gambling habit, causing Dolly Madison, James's wife, to sell off everything. Montpelier, its furniture, and even its slaves. And sadly, Dolly was pushed to absolute poverty in her final years. Just goes to show, it only takes one reckless kid to burn down an American dynasty. Way to go, Todd. But at least this next president didn't have a problem child, because Andrew Jackson's rise to wealth was insane. Born poor on the frontier, Jackson made his riches through a law practice, savvy land deals, and a well-timed marriage to his wife Rachel. And by 1804, he was rich enough to buy the Hermitage, a massive plantation he grew into 1,000 acres with 150 slaves working the cotton fields. So, by the time he died, Andrew Jackson's net worth sat around $130 million. From frontier orphan to one of the wealthiest men to ever sit in the White House. What a legend. Kinda like Theodore Roosevelt, except Teddy started out as a trust fund kid. Born into the affluent New York Roosevelt family, he inherited millions in today's money, and at just 22 years old, purchased Sagamore Hill, a 235-acre estate perched on prime Long Island real estate. Not a bad starter home. However, Teddy's fortune wasn't bulletproof, because he lost a huge chunk of his inheritance on a failed cattle ranch in the Dakotas when one brutal winter wiped out his herd. So he buckled down and made money the old-fashioned way, with his talents, cranking out more than 35 books on history, politics, and hunting. Roosevelt became a best-selling author. Add that to a presidential salary worth about $1.5 million in today's money, and Teddy was back on top. But by the end of his life, his greatest asset was still Sagamore Hill. His slogan should have been, speak softly, carry a big stick, and an even bigger estate. But if you thought Roosevelt was rich, this next guy nearly doubled him. Because Thomas Jefferson inherited 3,000 acres of land from his father and expanded it to a 5,000-acre plantation, where more than 600 slaves grew tobacco over his lifetime. And this is where he built his iconic Monticello estate, the one you see on the nickel. At his peak, Jefferson's fortune was worth the modern equivalent of $250 million. Life couldn't get much sweeter, until it all came crashing down. Because Jefferson had expensive taste, fine wines, European furniture, and thousands of rare books. He piled up so much debt that by the time he died, his family had to sell Monticello, his slaves, and most of his possessions. So, despite being one of the wealthiest Americans of his era, Jefferson blew it all in the end. Unlike George Washington, who absolutely secured the bag. Because George inherited Mount Vernon and gradually expanded it into an 8,000-acre estate with more than 300 slaves and a whiskey distillery. On top of that, he gained even more land through his wealthy wife Martha and went on a buying spree, snapping up 52,000 acres across Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Kentucky. This man was on a generational run. But despite being land-rich, he was often cash poor and had to rely on the presidential salary of $25,000 a year, which was 2% of the entire U.S. budget. And if you think that's chump change, $25,000 back then equals $700,000 in today's money. So yeah, add it all up, and George Washington's net worth peaked around $590 million. This dude wasn't just the father of the country, he was the original mega millionaire. But to these next presidents, he was basically poor, because we're moving on up to the Billy Club, the richest of the rich. Because John F. Kennedy didn't just become president, he inherited an empire. And most of it came from his father, who made millions through banking, stock trading, real estate, and Hollywood. And when you add in his wife Jackie, whose stepfather inherited a slice of the Standard Oil fortune, their combined wealth today tops $1 billion. Which is why the Kennedys spent summers cruising Martha's Vineyard on a luxury yacht instead of clipping coupons. And as for JFK's presidential salary, he didn't even need it. He donated the whole thing to charity. Just like this next guy, the richest president in United States history, Donald Trump, who was born into a wealthy real estate family and expanded the empire into office buildings, luxury hotels, and golf courses. And of course, there was this famous reality TV show. But Trump's crown jewel might be Mar-a-Lago, a 126-room mansion valued somewhere between $300 to $600 million. It's where he meets world leaders, golfs, and takes off on his $100 million private jet. Now this is the life, sir. Because Trump isn't just rich, his net worth is in the multi-billions. In fact, Trump's probably spent more time around Benjamin Franklin than the actual founding fathers. But if you think stacking bread is impressive, then you've clearly never eaten spoon bread. Because this is every US president's favorite food. From slurping squirrel soup, to eating marshmallow-covered sweet potatoes, to getting 3.5 tons of jelly beans delivered to the White House. Some presidents stuff the most absurd things into their bodies. So click this video right here and find out what fueled our most important leaders. 'Cause we're done with the fat stacks, and I'm craving a tasty snack.